cognitive scope limitation is the limit on the number of things that we can keep track of at the same time. So unfortunately, we are not omniscient. We also don't have an unlimited capacity to store information in our brain. We can only store so many things in our mind at the same time. And the cognitive scope limitation is what happens when we start simplifying reality that's too complex to keep in our mind all at the same time. And when that happens, we start to particularly treat people as objects. So how many people have been to New York City? Ever walked through Times Square? Just masses of people. And you see this guy barreling towards you, and it looks like he's going to run you over. Well, he might, frankly. And the reason is there are so many people in Times Square that it's very, very easy to stop looking at people as people and start treating people as objects. Our minds just can't keep that amount of information in our heads at the same time. And this is really a biological limit of what we are equipped to handle in terms of information. Aside from cybernetic brain upgrades, this is not going to change. So it's important to understand that there are situations in business, particularly when you start dealing with less than a small core group of employees or less than a small core group of customers. If you're dealing with thousands of customers and thousands of employees, the cognitive scope limitation applies to you. So you read in the newspaper about a CEO of a company that has tens or hundreds of thousands of employees and lays off 20% of their workforce. And some of the comments in that article make the CEO sound extremely insensitive about the plight of these employees. That insensitivity probably doesn't come because that CEO is an evil person who doesn't care. The fact is, there are so many people to keep track of that our brains don't naturally treat every individual in that company the same as that individual would maybe treat their best friend or feel about their best friend. The same thing happening to them. So this is a fundamental biological limitation of our minds that we can't directly improve, but we can kind of hack our way around. And the way we do that is by essentially personalizing the issue. And there are a couple ways to do this. The first one, and there was a great book about environmental sustainability in business called Green to Gold. And one of the CEOs that was interviewed for that book says, whenever I'm about to make a decision on an environmental level that may affect people that I don't even know and therefore can't think very rationally about, I think about my granddaughter. We call this the granddaughter rule. He said, I want to know if 10 or 20 years from now, my granddaughter is going to say to me, Grandpa, that was a really great decision, or Grandpa, that was a really boneheaded decision. So trying to personalize some of the long-term effects of the policies or decisions that he was going to make. The same thing happens if you, and I think this is something that Warren Buffett talked about, imagine the decision that you are about to make ends up on the front page of the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, and your parents read it. Is that something that they are going to be proud of you doing or not so proud of you doing? And so it's kind of a way of routing around this inability of our minds to keep everything in our heads at the same time. But personalizing it makes us care about someone we already care about. So it's a way of overcoming this limitation and making better decisions because of it.
Cognitive scope limitation. Questions for reflection. How can you personalize the results of actions or decisions that affect people outside of your immediate circle of friends, family, and peers? How can you remember to use the newspaper rule and the grandchild rule before making major decisions that affect others?
Now, association is the idea that the human mind stores information contextually. So our mind is not a database where things get filed away and then we run a search pattern and we look for the exact same thing. Our minds are designed to retrieve information quickly. And the best way to retrieve information quickly is to retrieve things kind of like what we're seeing. So because our brain stores patterns in long-term memory, it's very easy to pick up associations. And it's easy to think of associations even if things that we're thinking of aren't logically connected. Great example here. Let's say you're interested in learning how to play golf, and you go into the pro shop, and there's a display of the golf clubs that Tiger Woods used to win this famous tournament. Logically, you know that buying those golf clubs is not going to make you a better golfer, right? There's a certain amount of skill and ability and practice that's necessary in order to be good. But associatively, your brain picks up the connection of successful golfer, these golf clubs, and it influences your purchase behavior. And the interesting thing from a marketing perspective is there has been study after study done asking people, are you influenced by advertising? Everybody says, no. No, I know there's no connection there. But when they actually look at the purchase behavior of people before advertising and after advertising, those associations make a difference. So there is a reason that beer commercials feature attractive women and confident men. There is no logical connection between beer and those things, but the association makes a difference in purchase behavior anyway. It's a subconscious thing, happens automatically. And sometimes the association doesn't really even have to be explicit. Take, for example, I think it's the Omega watch company that will hire the actors that play James Bond. So Daniel Craig will be in a poster wearing a tuxedo, and the watch is clearly visible, and it never says James Bond. But the association of international super spy and the watch gets made anyway. And they've been doing that for decades, and it's because it sells watches. The association is made, it's subconscious, and it works. So it's important to understand that the associations are made. That's why you see all of these things. But it also, as a business owner, it helps for you to think about what are some of the associations that you could potentially make between what you're offering and something else that is already positively received. Because if you can draw an association, that is going to be beneficial in terms of people's purchase behavior.
Association. Questions for reflection. What do your customers currently associate your offers with? What would happen if you cultivated associations you'd like your prospective customers to have?
Absence blindness is a cognitive bias that prevents us from identifying what we can't see. So going back to the intersection of human physiology and human psychology, we are biologically equipped to see things that are present in our environment. That's why we have our five senses. We can see things, we can hear things, we can touch things. And because the presence of things is how our senses work, our psychology is meant to notice things that are there. It's not designed to notice things that aren't. So the famous Sherlock Holmes story of the dog that didn't bark in the night is an example of absence blindness. And Sherlock Holmes was a brilliant person because he noticed something that should have been there but wasn't. And that is really, really difficult to do. And part of what makes an expert at anything an expert is because they've seen so many things of what should be there that it's much easier for them to say something is not here that should be. There's a really fascinating story in a book called Sources of Power by Gary Klein that talks about expert performance and prediction. And there's a story of a firefighter. There's a house that's burning down. A group of firefighters goes in, and the captain of that team just has a funny feeling. It's a one-story house. They're spraying water on the fire, and just something doesn't feel right. Can't put his finger on it, but he says, something's wrong. We need to get our team out. Right after every member of the team exits the house, the whole house collapses in on itself. So this little intuition that the captain had saved his entire team. And what happened was the fire started in the basement. It was undermining the foundational support of the building. So when they were spraying water on the fire just wasn't responding because that wasn't the source. The source was down below. So the captain was able to notice something that wasn't happening and thereby save his team. But the reason he was able to notice that something wasn't happening was because he had a lot of experience fighting fires. So absence blindness makes prevention grossly underappreciated, grossly. And a good example of this in companies is take manager A versus manager B. Manager A doesn't look like they're doing very much. No emergencies, no fires, things just work, but frankly, it looks really boring. Like not much is going on. Manager B is in constant motion. getting things done, fighting fires, solving emergencies, running around like a chicken with their head cut off. And it looks like there's a lot of energy and effort there. And it looks like the manager is doing a really good job because they're trying to keep a hold of this really bad position, even if that bad position was caused by the manager in the first place. Manager A may be preventing problems before they ever occur, where Manager B was just responding to the problems that were allowed to occur in the first place. So because we are psychologically more equipped to handle things that aren't there, we tend to value Manager B more than we value Manager A. We value what looks like energy expended or work being done instead of preventing those things from happening in the first place, or setting up the situation in a way that benefits us without a whole lot of work. So the best way to avoid absence blindness is to create a checklist and to notice patterns in the work that you're doing so you're able to see what should be there and what shouldn't be there. And checklists are really important because it's very easy to overlook things that aren't there. So a simple reminder to yourself to look for this thing goes a long way to avoiding absence blindness in the moment, particularly for human behavior things like performance reviews. So if you remind yourself to look for ways that this person has prevented certain things from happening, or has structured their environment such that they get results without a whole lot of effort, that's a good thing, not a bad thing. So it's important to understand absence blindness happens automatically. We all suffer from it. And so we need just little reminders to look for the things that are missing or to reward the things that aren't happening that are good.
Absence blindness. Questions for reflection. How can you use your team's expertise to identify things that should be present but aren't? What could you be overlooking? And how can you increase the probability you'll remember to check?
In a similar manner, physiologically, our senses are designed to notice contrast, differences between things. We aren't very well equipped to notice the equivalent of a white rabbit in a snowstorm, right? There's not enough contrast. There's not enough detail between the thing that we're trying to notice and the background. All of our senses work by noticing the difference between what we're looking at and everything else. Not necessarily comparing what we perceive with things that aren't there, like in absence blindness. Now, when it comes to business, contrast is often used to influence buying decisions. So you highlight the difference between what you have and everything else in the market. You highlight the difference between one offer and another offer. There's actually a wonderful book about human psychology called Influence by Robert Cialdini. If you haven't read it, you should. Talks about 6 fundamental principles of human psychology. Contrast is one of them. And you can influence people's actions by either increasing or decreasing the contrast between different items or different options. Can anybody think of an example of a use of contrast for, let's say, pricing? How would you use contrast to influence a pricing decision? Look at the market. So how would you do that?
Show them something much more expensive.
Yeah, exactly. Or a sale item, yes. So this is actually going back to our discussion of framing, of controlling the information that you expose a person to while they're in the process of making a decision. Price framing looks something like, look at all the benefits that you are going to get from this thing that I am offering. And look, here's something else out there in the world that is much more expensive in terms of money, in terms of time, in terms of opportunity cost. One of the ways that I market the personal MBA to new people or people who aren't familiar with it is that you can either read a book or go to a 3-day seminar, or you could spend 2 years and a couple $100,000 learning roughly the same thing. That's a contrast decision, right? And that contrast makes the 3 days or reading the $20 book a really appealing alternative. So you can use contrast to present your offer and improve the way that customers view what you have to offer. You just look at something that's closely related to it and compare the two against each other.
Contrast. Questions for reflection. What are your prospects currently contrasting your offer against? Can you offer an alternate contrast that presents your offer in a more attractive way?
Scarcity is another one of those human psychological factors that encourages people to act. So think of our ancestral environment 100,000 years ago. If you see a bush full of berries, and there are only so many berries on that bush, and they're not going to grow back anytime soon, it's in your best interest to take those berries while they're there, right? You can't afford to wait because they may not be there the next time you're looking for them. So scarcity is a reason for people to act now. It's an encouragement to act quickly. So anything that is a limited offer, limited quantities, something that people can take advantage of for a limited time, all of those elements add to the scarcity of an offer. The more scarce the offer is, the more people tend to naturally want it. Because if they wait, they risk the potential for loss. And as we talked about in loss aversion, people hate to lose. They hate the feeling of potential loss. So that's why scarcity makes people act quickly. Now, there are a few ways to actually create scarcity in an offer. The first is limited quantities. We only have 20. When they're gone, they're gone. If that's true, then people will buy now versus waiting later. The second is price increases in the near future. So if you act now, you can get a lower price than you would if you wait a week or wait a month or wait a year. The third way is a price decrease that will end in the near future. So this is something like a discount. It's kind of the same thing as a price going up, but you're artificially decreasing the price for a certain amount of time. And if they wait, they lose that discount. And the fourth is a deadline. After a certain point in time, this thing is no longer going to be available. So if you wait, you're not going to be able to get it. So by adding an element of scarcity to the offer, you're going to encourage people to take an action now instead of procrastinating. Because when people say, I'm going to do it later, oftentimes that turns into, I'm going to do it never. So adding some element of scarcity will encourage people to act now versus waiting. And talking about the psychological element of pricing, decreasing the price for some things, particularly high-end or luxury items.
It's like Louis Vuitton goes on sale.
Exactly, yes. If Louis Vuitton goes on sale, they're sending a negative signal about their offer, right? But if the price is going to go up, become even more expensive and even more exclusive over a period of time, then that is going to be more attractive for that particular market and that particular audience. So artificial scarcity is where if you try to inject an element of scarcity that doesn't have any truth to it, you're just saying it's only available for a certain amount of time, but there's no reason that it's available for a certain amount of time, people start to feel like that's manipulative, and it can actually have the opposite approach. The diamond industry is based on artificial scarcity in a lot of ways. And so over time, what that makes people feel is that you're manipulating them, and they start to trust you less and look for alternatives. So you have to be very careful with adding scarcity where there's no good reason to. And if you're going to use a scarcity element, it can be tremendously effective. But you have to explain, this goes back to giving people a reason why for your behavior. You have to explain why the scarcity element is in place. And you have to explain it to them in a way that they're going to agree that, yes, there's a reason for this scarcity. All sorts of cartel types of arrangements operate largely on reducing supply and making scarcity where none really has to exist.
Scarcity. Questions for reflection. Does your offer have an element of scarcity? If not, what limited time or quantity option could you add to your offer to make it more compelling?
Now, novelty is the presence of new sensory data. And novelty is really, really important if you want to attract and maintain a person's attention over a long period of time. So from a sensory standpoint, human beings are designed to gather a lot of information about the environment, as much information as possible. And new things have to be happening in the environment all the time because we really like to collect that information. When you do a practice like meditation, which we talked about earlier, meditation is really hard because we are, in a sense, depriving ourselves of new sensory data, right? And it's really difficult to maintain attention on one thing for a long period of time. Our mind starts to wander, our mind starts to do different things. And the practice of meditation is beneficial because it helps to train you to bring your focus back to one thing. That's why it's useful as a personal practice. But we can use that example of our mind wanting to go someplace else after a certain amount of time naturally as an example of if you want to maintain someone's attention, you need to go to something else on a regular basis. There's a really wonderful book called Brain Rules by John Medina. He's a neuroscientist. And he talks about when he is lecturing on neuroscience, he makes sure that he changes topics at least once every 10 minutes. Because if he drones on for an hour about one little thing, people just zone out. But if he keeps his lectures in very small increments and switches from one thing to another constantly, people listen, they pay attention, they engage. There is a reason that this course is structured the way it is. And this is particularly important for companies who are trying to market the same thing over a long period of time, like decades. Because if you are offering the same thing, you're offering it in the same way, you're talking about it in the same way, you just become part of the background. There's nothing new. And people get bored and people stop paying attention to you. When I was in brand marketing at P&G, we had some very sophisticated models. So we would come out with a commercial for Febreze. And that commercial would be tremendously effective for about 12 weeks. And after that point, and there was all sorts of sophisticated analysis that was done on how long we were running this advertisement versus the amount of volume we were moving, and there was just a cliff. Somewhere between 12 and 14 weeks, it would just fall. So the reason that a lot of these companies are creating different commercials over and over and over again is it's a pure novelty thing. Characters in commercials, there may be some common thread or some common theme behind it, but there's always something new that that person is doing. So the recent example of the Old Spice man, right? Complete novelty, hadn't really been done before, completely new off-the-wall things that people have never seen before that are really funny and visually very compelling. And every couple months, a new one comes out. And when the new one comes out, people perk up and pay attention because it is new. So adding some element of novelty or changing the way you're talking about something or adding a new element that people haven't seen before, that's how you maintain people's attention over a long period of time. When I first started in advertising, it was like, we've been doing this for decades. Like, why are we spending so much money every couple months to shoot a brand new commercial? Like, don't we have this archive of all this great stuff that we've done in the past? And the truth was, yeah. Procter & Gamble alone has an archive of probably hundreds of thousands of commercials over the past several decades. And airing those would be disastrous because they would be boring. And so new things, new ways of talking about what you do maintain people's attention. And if the purpose of what you're doing is to get attention, having something new will be very effective. That's the human mind.
Novelty. Questions for reflection. Are you offering your prospects something new on a regular basis to maintain their attention? What can you do to keep people from getting bored with what you have to offer?
So let's shift gears a little bit into personal productivity, working with yourself. How to use your mind to get things done, which is pretty important, right? We all have things we want to do, and it helps to understand how to work with ourselves to make it easy for us to do the things we want to do, and how to avoid fighting against ourselves in the process of doing what we want to do. And going back and reviewing one of the things we talked about in caveman syndrome, a lot of the things that we're doing in the modern business environment are really difficult for us biologically. They're really hard. We're not designed for this stuff. So there are a few ways that we can recognize the parts of business and the parts of decision making and the parts of communication that are naturally hard for us and find a way to route around it or find a way to hack it or find a way to make it a little bit easier. So we're going to be talking about a few of those things now.
Working with yourself. Questions for reflection. How aware are you of your own mental processes? How productive are you on a daily basis?
The first idea in personal productivity is an idea called monoidealism. And monoidealism is the state of focusing your energy and attention on one and only one thing at a time. So monoidealism has been called a lot of different things over the years. One of the most popular is a psychologist by the name of Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi wrote a book called Flow. And he described flow as this experience of when you get so wrapped up into something that everything else just falls away. You are completely present, you can sustain your attention, you have a lot of progress, it feels really good. You're in the zone. There are all sorts of words for this state. And theories about how to get here have been proposed by probably tens of thousands of people over the course of the last several centuries. When it comes down to it, the productivity techniques that you use in terms of how you schedule your day and how you define your work and the practices and whether you use a journal or not, there are all sorts of productivity techniques that are out there. The success criteria of any productivity technique is fundamentally whether it helps you get into a monoideal state or not. If a technique works for you and helps you get here, it's going to help you be more effective. If it doesn't, it's not going to be very effective for you. So it really helps when you're evaluating ways of working better to know that monoidealism is the goal. Now, there are a couple of things that can help you, no matter the technique you use to get here, that can help you stay here once you get here. And the first thing, going back to our discussion of guiding structure, is to eliminate distractions. The very worst thing is you use some productivity technique, it works, you start to be productive, and then something like the phone rings, or your email notification dings and you have 18 new messages, or a coworker stops by and says, hey, can I pick your brain for a minute? It breaks the monoideal state. Actually, a lot of the first organizational research around monoidealism had to do with programmers, because programming is extremely mentally intense. On average, it takes somewhere between 10 and 15 minutes of starting work before you actually get into the state. And what they found with programming is it takes usually a minimum of 30 minutes when that state is broken to get back into it. So the absolute worst working situation for a programmer is to start to program, be interrupted, start to program again, be interrupted, on and on and on and on and on until no programming has happened that day and nothing else has been accomplished either. If what you're doing requires any concentration for any period of time, you need to have that lack of distractions. Paul Graham, a venture capitalist, actually started one of the first web stores, which sold to Yahoo. Now runs a venture capital firm called Y Combinator. He wrote a brilliant, brilliant essay called Maker Schedule and Manager Schedule. So if you are a manager, your job is usually to communicate and to collaborate and to organize people, right? And that involves a lot of small meetings, lots of relatively small chunks of time, up to an hour maximum, where you're just going around and you're talking with people. But if you're responsible for making something, for creating something in any way, shape, or form, could be a program, could be writing a proposal, could be developing a corporate strategy, doesn't matter. If you're responsible for creating something, you need relatively large chunks of uninterrupted time to actually think and get into a monoideal state so you're actually productive. And the way that Paul Graham said it is you can either operate on a maker schedule or a manager schedule and do it effectively as long as you don't try to mix the two at the same time. What happens a lot is in companies that have more of an open layout or have a culture of having meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting, is the real work of the organization is done in the early morning and after hours, right? And you have people working until 10 o'clock at night because they were in meetings all day, but they're responsible for writing a proposal and they never had enough concentrated time to do it. I'll tell you, one of my clients, who's the CEO of a design and animation company, we were talking and he was having this very standard complaint. I'm in meetings all day, nobody can get anything done. And it's really stressful because people were overworking themselves and productivity was suffering because of it. And here's what he did. He had a meeting with his entire staff, and he said, from now on, no one has any meetings in the morning, period. There's one person who is responsible for taking emergency calls from clients if they need to contact us. But nobody has a meeting, nobody checks email. Mornings are for getting things done. Afternoons are for meetings. And if you want to meet with me, I'm establishing a couple hours for office hours. So if you want to stop by and pick my brain or get my approval or whatever, you can just stop by. I'm going to be available during this time. I'm not going to be doing anything else.
And schedule accordingly.
And schedule accordingly, exactly. After a week, he's like, it is a completely different environment around here. People are getting things done. They're much happier. The meetings that we do need to have are being done far more effectively than they had been otherwise. And in terms of clients, they completely understood because they're hiring us to do work for them and they want us to do our best work. And part of what made it work was he was the CEO, and so he was doing it and all of his executive team were doing it, so it made it okay for other people to do it as well. When this type of approach doesn't tend to work is when the lead executive team is not the one that's pushing it or is not supportive of it. So a counterexample, I had a client who worked in a large technology company who was suffering from the same thing. And he was in the middle of the management structure, was managing his own teams, and tried to push for this approach. And it broke down when his boss and his boss's boss wanted to have a meeting in the middle of the day, which meant that everybody else down the chain had to have the meeting because they didn't understand and they didn't support it. This is one of those things that if you have control over your working environment, one of the most effective things that you can do is block out a large chunk, at least one large chunk of time, preferably early in the day, and then save all your phone calls and meetings and emails and all of that until later. I'll tell you what I do. Aside from blocking off time, the two things you really need to do is first eliminate as many distractions as you possibly can, or even the potential of a distraction. So rip the phone cord out of the wall, shut off your cell phone, turn off your email. When I'm writing, I block the internet completely because I don't want anything to pop up, to ding, to be tempted to go to the internet and surf around to do some quote-unquote research. I just block everything. So eliminating as many distractions as you can at the beginning, setting aside a chunk of time where you know that you're not going to have anything else that you need to do, and then I have a little timer that sits by my desk. And I usually set that timer for something like 10, 15, 20 minutes. And that's a little technique called a dash. And this is particularly useful if you're not particularly feeling like focusing at that moment. You just say, okay, you give yourself permission, I'm just gonna do it for 15 minutes. And if I'm still not feeling it, or if I'm not being very productive, then I'll stop doing this thing and I'll start doing something else.
You really feel good when you get it done in 15 minutes.
Well, yeah, you either get it done in 15 minutes if it's a short thing, or by the time the timer dings, you're already in a mono-ideal state and you're already feeling good, and so you just keep going for the extended duration of the time. I can't tell you how many times I have tricked myself into writing for 4 hours by setting a 15-minute timer and not having a distraction to pull me out of it. So there are all sorts of different ways to do it. That's probably the simplest and most straightforward thing to do. It's also really good practice. Because we like novelty, sometimes concentrating on a task for an extended period of time, particularly if it's difficult, one of the reasons I block the internet is because the novelty-seeking part of my brain, when a part of writing gets hard or a part of programming gets hard, wants to go look at something else. The other benefit of meditation is it provides practice of pulling your focus back to what it was that you wanted to focus on after it strays. And the more consistently you're able to do that, the easier working for longer periods of time becomes.
Monoidealism. Questions for reflection. How often do you find yourself working in a monoideal state? Can you restructure your work to make it easier to just do it?
Now, related to monoidealism, let's take the opposite of monoidealism. This is an idea called the cognitive switching penalty. And this is a effect of neurologically, multitasking is impossible for us. We can't really do two things at once. We can try to do more than one thing at once, but what's actually happening is we focus our attention on one thing, then we remove that attention and focus our attention on something else. So focus and remove, focus and remove, focus and remove. Every time you switch the focus of your attention, it takes just a little while for your brain to kind of load the context of what you're doing. And that represents some friction. So every time you focus on something new, your brain has to go through its own little startup process before you can actually make progress on it. And there have been several studies on this. You see people who think they are just the most effective multitaskers in the entire world. And then you measure their productivity and compare them against someone who is focusing on only one thing at a time. And the people who focus on only one thing at a time outperform the people who multitask by several orders of magnitude. So think of every time you switch your attention from one thing to another, you're incurring a cost, you're incurring a penalty. So it follows from that, the less you switch the object of your attention, the more productive you're going to be. Because of monoidealism, you can focus on it, you can make progress, get it done, and then focus your attention on something else. So one way to avoid unnecessary and unproductive switching is to group similar tasks together. This is a technique called batching. Let's say you have some focused work you need to get done, like writing or programming or creating a proposal or whatever, and you also have some errands, picking up the dry cleaning, going to the grocery store, or dropping something off at the post office. You could do your grocery shopping and then write a little bit, and go to the post office and write a little bit, and pick up your dry cleaning and write a little bit. But it's not going to be very effective, right? As long as you're out running errands, you might as well do all of the errands right in a row and then come back and spend more time of focused attention writing or programming or whatever. Let's use that errands analogy to do something that's probably more common in a business environment, which is I'm gonna work a little bit and then I'm gonna check my email. I'm gonna work a little bit and I'm gonna check my email. Or work a little bit, phone call, email. Those types of switching games are really, really expensive. So doing something like checking email only once or twice a day, doing it all at once, and keeping your program closed for the rest of the time allows you to switch less. And when you switch less, you get more things done. It's really interesting that a lot of these things are practices that most people aren't doing. And if they really help you be more effective, that means that in the wild world of work, these become your competitive advantages of getting things done above and beyond what other people are doing.
Cognitive switching penalty. Questions for reflection. How often do you try to multitask? Can you rearrange your schedule to batch similar tasks together?
Now, when we're talking about doing things, or getting things done in the broadest sense, it helps to have a working definition of what doing means. And this is something that I call the 4 methods of completion. So there are really only 4 ways that you can quote unquote complete or finish something. And the first one is pretty basic. You can do it, you can complete it. You can just work on the thing that needs to be done until it is done. Straightforward. But that's not the only way that you can do it. The second is deletion. You can finish a task by saying, not important, I'm not going to do it. Cross it off the list, it is now complete. You can delegate it, which is just assigning the task to somebody else. So it's important, it needs to be done, but I don't need to be the person who does it. I am going to assign it to a contractor, an employee, someone else who is not me, so they can do it. Now, the trick with delegation is you have to have someone to delegate to, right? So even if you are a solo entrepreneur in a basement, having a contractor, having someone else, an assistant, someone to whom you can delegate is really important, even for the little things. My wife Kelsey and I both run businesses. We both work from home, and we have a young child. There are some things in our life that if they were added to our to-do list, so for example, deep house cleaning, crazy making. It's a good thing we don't have to be the person who does that. So we hire a lady, her name is Alma. She comes once every couple weeks, and she does some of the things that we don't have time to do. And it is worth every single penny, because that's one less thing that we need to think about, and that gives us more time and energy to do things that only we can do. That's delegation. And the last is called deferment, putting it off, saying it's not important enough for me to do right now. And the key for deferment, it can be a very effective strategy as long as you're doing it consciously. So if you are unconsciously deferring something, we call it procrastination, and we tend to feel really bad about that. You just push it and push it and push it, and you feel really crappy because you're not getting your stuff done. And it feels like this overwhelming weight. You can accomplish the same thing by looking at the list of things you have to do and saying, I still want to do that, but I'm not going to do it right now. And you can just make a little note to yourself to revisit it later. And the psychological and the emotional experience of actively deferring something instead of passively deferring something is completely different. And as a result, you can go through your checklist and say, what are the things that I can delete? Just cross it off, not important. What can I delegate to somebody else? What can I defer? As kind of your first pass through the list, and then you have a list of the things that you and only you can do that are important that you must get done right now. So that provides a very basic way of processing a to-do list. Go through and make sure you're considering all 4 options, and have the doing part come last. So you go through your list, you see what can move off of your plate first, then you have a list of things that you and only you can do.
The 4 methods of completion. Questions for reflection. Make a list of all of the things on your mind. Which of these things can be deleted, delegated, or deferred to a later date? How many of these tasks can you move off your plate immediately?
That leads us to an idea called most important tasks. I usually abbreviate MITs. A most important task is a critical task that will create the most important results for your particular goals. They are the things that you and only you can do that are going to lead most clearly and most directly to the most important things that you want to accomplish. Because not everything on your to-do list is going to be critically important. You may have an item on your to-do list that is launch new product and contact prospective customers, which for the operation of a new business is critically important. You don't have a business until you do those things. You may, on the same list, have an item like drop off dry cleaning. May still be important in some sense of the term, but is clearly not as important as the most important things on your list. So there's a practice or a habit that you can establish when working through your to-do list, and it looks like this. Every single day, take your overall to-do list and pick 2 or 3 things. Go through your list and pick 2 or 3 things that are clearly the most important things that you need to do right now. If it's not clear, guess. Just pick one. But you're creating a very small sub-list of all the things that you could be doing. And you're saying, today, these are the most important things I need to get done. Keeping a list can actually be a really good practice because it gets it out of your mind and into some external form you can reference later. But that big list doesn't have to be the list that you actively work from. You can just look at that list and pick the 2 or 3 most important things. I use 3x5 index cards all the time. And what I do is I keep a list of all the things I need to do in a notebook, but I work from a 3x5 index card that only has 2 things on it. And the key here is because you're working from a shorter list, it's easier to focus on the most important things. But by defining them as most important, you're also implicitly giving yourself permission to not do the other 5 billion things that are on your list because they're not as important as the one that's sitting in front of you right now. If you want a recipe to feel really good at work every single day, you create this list of MITs, preferably the day before, so you don't have to think about it, you just have it. You focus on nothing else until those MITs are done. And you challenge yourself to get those things done as quickly as you possibly can. There is nothing better than having a workday in which you get your 3 most important things done and it's 10 o'clock in the morning and you have the rest of the day to get even more good things done or to focus on things that you haven't had time to do for a long time. So acquiring a skill requires a block of attention that is devoted to that. And if acquiring that skill is one of the very most important things that you could be doing, that should go on your MIT list. Do that first before anything else. And not to go too far down a rabbit hole, but the model of schooling that most nations have adopted in terms of compulsory public education is based squarely around an industrial model. So they're training you to be on an assembly line as part of a big structure where you don't have a whole lot of self-determination. It's really broken because most of the high-value work that is being done in the world right now is the exact opposite of the mindset that you need to work on an assembly line. There's a really great book called The Underground History of American Education by John Taylor Gatto, and it's several hundred pages, massive, massive volume. And just one example, if you think of something like the cognitive switching penalty, which is really important to understand if you want to get a lot of good work done today, and you go to a public school system and every 40 minutes they ring a bell that tells you you have to stop doing whatever you're doing and go focus on something else now, you start to see how broken it is. So yes, a lot of the things that we're learning now aren't taught in school. You have to teach yourself, and the faster you learn these things, and if you have kids, the faster you help them master these skills, the more effective and the happier they're going to be when it comes to actually getting productive work done. There's a really awesome pre-printed pad called the Emergent Task Planner by David Shee. It's fantastic. What it does is it combines a daily calendar with a list of MITs at the top, and it has some space for notes or details during the day. Talk about a really great example of guiding structure. If every day, the night before, you lay out your MITs, you schedule time for them, you look at your calendar, you schedule time for that, you have your entire day on a single sheet of paper with your MITs planned out first. Dave, he is an excellent designer, does a lot of really awesome productivity stuff. The Emergent Task Planner is my absolute favorite of the things that he has done. You can download it off the internet or you can buy the pre-printed pads, either way. All sorts of different ways to do it, but if you're looking for a very convenient way to put it all on one page, highly recommend checking that out.
Most important tasks. Questions for reflection. What are the 3 most important things you could accomplish today that would move your projects forward? How can you structure your day to ensure your most important tasks are done first, before anything else?
Now, we are working and trying to get things done. Let's take a step back and talk about how we decide what we want to get done, or what is most important. So if most important tasks are the things that will lead us to what we want, it helps us to have an understanding of what we want. And there are some very basic definitions that are useful to get clear in our heads before we start talking about techniques of how to find them. And the first is, a very common word in business today, goals. What is a goal? A goal is a statement that describes precisely what you want to achieve. Goals are achievements. For a well-formed goal, you should be able to look out there in the world and see whether or not you have accomplished it. I use a technique that I call the Everest test, which is a goal is something like, I want to climb Mount Everest by this date. If you are standing at the top of Mount Everest before that date, you have achieved the goal. You can look out into your world and say, yes, done. You may also have the goal of making it down from the top of Mount Everest alive. And that is also a goal, right? You can see that that is indeed the case. Goals are time-bound, and we'll talk about some criteria of what makes a good goal. There are actually 4 characteristics. It's positive, immediate, concrete, and specific. So positive, remember we were talking about motivation. You can either be moving towards something or away from it. The best goals are positive. You're moving towards something that you want to see in your world. They're immediate, so your goals should be something that you decide to make progress on right now. They're important enough to focus on in the present, not someday. So David Allen, in Getting Things Done, recommends a separate list of things that you may someday maybe like to do. Put them on your someday maybe list, not on your active goals list. But the worst way to view something like a bucket list is, oh my gosh, there are 50 things that I want to do and I should be thinking about all of these things right now. No, it's just a holding place where you may pick one of those things and say, yeah, I am finally going to travel to Antarctica now. And then if you're willing to make it immediate, something you're willing to work on right now, then it comes off the bucket list and onto an active goal.
Exactly, right.
Now, concrete means you're able to see a result in the real world. It has to be tangible. It has to be something that you will notice. And specific is you have to be able to define what, where, and when you are going to achieve that goal. Lots of acronyms based around these general characteristics. One of the popular ones is SMART goals, right? SMART, SMAC of acronyms or similar things that people use. And what you'll notice in all of these things is there are elements of positive, immediate, concrete, and specific in it. So I like this because it's clearer and it's shorter. So it's important also that your goals be things that are under your control, that you can make progress on by taking some effort. And a classic thing that doesn't fit this pattern is doing something like, I want to lose a certain amount of weight, right? Goals like that tend to be soul destroying for the reason that it's a result. It's not directly under your control. Because let's say you're working really hard and you step on the scale every day and a couple days you're up, and so you lose a couple pounds one day and you're back up a couple the next day. And if you're working really hard and you're not seeing that tangible result, it can be really, really difficult to keep that going or to feel excited or to keep doing it. So the goals shouldn't necessarily be on that end result, although that may be something that you want. The goal should be based around taking the action that will lead to the result. So if you do something like exercise for 30 minutes a day, you can feel good about exercising 30 minutes a day regardless of what your weight does. But if you exercise more, that result is going to come gradually, even if the day-to-day fluctuations go up and down. Focus on the process. Focus on things that you can choose to do and then to do, not necessarily a result that comes directly from that. So take what sounds like a goal. I want to lose a pound a day. You don't control that, but you do control what you eat and how much you exercise. When I coach most people on goals, what I almost always tell them is there will be a draft list of things that sound like goals. And people are usually pretty good about the positive and the immediate thing, right? Moving towards something and making it be something that they want right now. What I almost always tell people is there a way to make it more specific? Is there a way to make it more concrete? So instead of just learning Turkish, you are having a conversation with a specific person within a certain time period. And that makes it far easier to plan to do things that will actually lead to that result, which does satisfy the criteria of learning how to speak Turkish. It's just an easier way to get there. And that's exactly what the specific and concrete is designed to do. It's to help you define what does done look like for this thing. The reason that most people fail on the goals that they set is it's not concrete and specific enough. Or it's so nebulous that it's hard to think of what is the next thing that I should do that will get me there. Sometimes when you are moving towards a goal, you find that it's not really something you're excited about, or your attitude toward that particular goal changes. It's perfectly okay if something's not important enough to you to continue working towards it. Scratching a goal off your list is basically the same thing as deletion on your to-do list. Not important enough for me to do right now. So I'm going to consciously choose that that's not important, cross it off my list, consider that a completion, and choose another goal to work on. There's nothing wrong with that.
Goals. Questions for reflection. What's your desired end state? Have you set a destination that your brain can plan to move closer to? If you don't yet know what you want, can you set a temporary goal for now and leave yourself open to course correction as you progress?
Now, an important distinction. This is an idea called a state of being. A lot of people, when they set goals, they include statements like, I want to be happy. I want to be successful. I want to be famous. I want to be rich. I want to be fill in the blank. Those aren't goals. Particularly, being happy or being successful is a really good example of this, because you can be feeling happy or feeling successful one day, and the next day you can be feeling miserable and feeling like a failure. And it fluctuates. And it's really difficult to make those things more specific and more concrete, which is a really good indication that they're not goals to begin with. They're something else. And that something else is a state of being. We're going to define a state of being as a quality of your present experience. It's something that you are experiencing on a minute-by-minute basis throughout your day. So states of being aren't achievements. What they are decision criteria. So it is legitimately something you want, something you may be striving for, but it doesn't pass the Everest test. It's not something like, yay, I've reached the top of Mount Everest. I am now happy, I am now successful, and will be forevermore. It doesn't work that way. What those qualities help you do is to look at how you're spending your time and your energy and help you ask a question. Is what I'm doing right now leading to more happiness in my life? Is what I'm doing right now helping me feel successful? Is what I'm doing right now helping me feel free? It's a decision criteria, because if those things are helping you feel those things that you want to feel or have the experience you want to experience, then great, they're working. So keep doing what you're doing or do more of what you're doing. If what you're doing is not helping you feel those things or is helping you experience the opposite of what you want to feel or experience, then you should stop doing what you're doing. For example, one of my preferred states of being is I want to feel free. I want to feel free to work on what I want to work on, who I want to work on it with, under what time period, and choose the projects that I take on. Working in a large company on a day-to-day basis made me feel or experience the opposite of those things on a daily basis. So for me, in that situation, that state of being of wanting to feel free, that was a decision criteria for me. It's like all these things that I'm doing are actually leading me further and further away from how I want to live my life on a daily basis. So something needs to change. And that something that needed to be changed was I needed to leave my job and start my own business, which helps me feel more of those things on a daily basis. So part of a goal-setting process, when you start to write down your goals and try to figure all of these things out for yourself, there will be some things on that list that aren't really goals, they're states of being. So it's really important when you go through your first list of goals, and we'll talk about a process called personal master planning here in a moment that will help you do this. When you write down that initial list, it's very important to ask yourself for everything on that list, why do I want that? So take what sounds like a goal, so something like, I want to be a millionaire. I want to have $1 million in my bank account. Sounds like a goal, right? It's tangible. You can see your bank account. When it has $1 million in it, great. Achievement achieved. But when you ask yourself why you want to have $1 million in your bank account, you start getting some very interesting responses like, well, that would make me feel secure. Well, why do I want to feel secure? Because I don't want to have to worry. Why don't I want to have to worry? Because I want to feel free. And you end up with something that sounds very much like a state of being. And the good news is there are hundreds of thousands of ways or things that you can do to feel more free that you can do today that do not involve in any way, shape, or form having $1 million in your bank account, right? You can start getting what you actually want instead of what may be a very ambitious thing that takes a long period of time that isn't worth it to you. So if the end result is you want to feel free more of the time, you should start doing things that actually help you do that now, instead of setting what appears to be a very far out goal that may actually lead to more or less of what it is you actually want. So it's a critical distinction to make. Goals and states of being are completely different. Goals are achievements, states of being are decision criteria. So if your goals are well formed, they help you feel more of your states of being. If your states of being are well formed, it helps you choose the goals that will lead there.
States of being. Questions for reflection. What are 3 to 5 states of being you'd like to experience on a daily basis? Are your current actions helping you experience your most preferred states of being most of the time? What are factors in your life that are leading away from your preferred states of being, and how could you potentially change or eliminate them?
Now, there's one more distinction of types of things that tend to show up when we think about setting goals broadly, and that is a habit. And habits are regular actions that support us in what we want to do. So for example, things like brushing your teeth, or taking vitamins, or any number of the things that you want to do on a daily or weekly basis to take care of yourself or your surroundings. They aren't really goals, right? Because if you brush your teeth one day, it's not done now and forevermore, right? It's not an achievement. But that action may lead to something that helps you feel a certain way, which is healthy or calm or sane. Your habits are actions that support you, particularly in your states of being, right? Think of them as maintenance tasks, things that you want to do on a regular basis, but aren't a goal or aren't a state of being. Now, because we talked about accumulation, so small things adding up as you do them over and over and over again, something as small as brushing your teeth or flossing your teeth over a period of decades can produce really massive results versus not doing it. So these small things, they feel really small in the moment, but over long periods of time accumulate to really big results. So it's important to focus on them. But habits, going back to our conversation of willpower, habits take willpower to install, and we only have so much of it to go around. So a lot of times when you think of all of the things that you quote unquote should be doing in a given day, you may have 100 things that would qualify as a habit. I need to brush my teeth, floss my teeth, take a shower, empty out my email inbox, pick up the mail. All of these things start to look like a really big list. And some of them we're probably already doing without much effort and we're not really thinking about it. Some of them we think we should be doing, but we're not doing it consistently. The key is because installing a habit requires willpower, you should choose one habit, new habit, to focus on. Structure your environment to make installing that habit easier, and continue to practice it until it's one of those things that is just what you do. It requires no thought, no effort, no willpower. It's just part of your life. So for me, one of the habits I wanted to install a couple of years ago was remembering to take my vitamins. Because I bought them, they sat in a cupboard somewhere, I never saw them, so I never took them, and I wanted to start doing that. So what I did was I put my vitamins right next to my toothbrush, which was a habit that I already had installed. This is an idea called a trigger and an endpoint. So if you want to install a new habit, you can use the existence of another habit as a trigger to do the next thing. So I put my vitamins by my toothbrush. When I brushed my teeth, I saw my vitamins, and therefore I took the vitamins. Then if I want to do something else, I can structure my environment so after I take my vitamins, that reminds me to do something else, and you create kind of a chain. Or doing something like, if you want to figure out what your MITs are and journal a little bit before the end of the day, a structural change like using a trigger when you get home, something that you do on a consistent basis to remind you to put your journal on your pillow, that's an environmental change. So when you go to bed, it's like, journal, I need to do that now, and then you do it. So how easy or difficult it is to install a habit depends on how well you can structure your environment to make it easier or harder. There's an example Zig Ziglar used, and I think see at the top, which is a train without tracks is completely free, but it can't go anywhere, right? It's the tracks, it's the structure that helps it get where it's supposed to go. Same thing with a car without a steering wheel. And after a while, it just becomes second nature and you don't have to think about it. So that's the idea with habits, is ideally we're getting to a point where it's an automatic thing that we just do. We don't have to think about it. We do it every time. But when you're installing a habit, you have to exert some conscious effort and structure your environment so you remember to do it. And over time, that becomes effortless. And then you can focus that time and energy on installing another new habit. But that's the golden rule, one habit at a time. And that's starting to anticipate one of the things we're going to talk about in systems, which is standard operating procedures and checklists, and setting those structures in your work that are equivalent like the tracks to the train. So you decide on the structure, how you want the work to unfold once, first, as a template, and then within those constraints, you go nuts on the creativity, and that allows you to be creative for the end result that you want with far less energy than you would expend otherwise trying to do the structure and be creative at the same time.
Habits. Questions for reflection. What productive habits have you already installed? What habits, if you installed them, would produce positive results in your life? Are there any triggers or structural changes you could use to make installing habits easier?
Couple more ideas. Priming is a method of consciously programming your brain to alert you when particular information is present in your environment. And a good tangible example of this, I think we've all had the experience of being in the market for a new car. And we decide that we're interested in a particular make and model of vehicle, and all of a sudden, it feels like the universe is playing a trick on you, because it's like the universe unloaded all of these cars all over the highway, the exact same thing that you're interested in. You start seeing them everywhere. And the interesting thing is, those cars were always there. You just never paid attention to it. You just never noticed. But as soon as you decided to be interested in something, all of a sudden your mind codes that information as relevant to you, and your brain starts having you notice or pay attention to when it does exist. This is an idea called priming. And the cool thing about priming is we can use it intentionally to influence our pattern matching processes. So for example, one of the benefits, aside from helping us plan what we're going to do to achieve our goals, one of the benefits of having a goals list in the first place is it is a method of priming our brain to look for things that we want. When I decided to write the personal MBA, because I decided to write a book, I was starting to think about all the things that would go into the book, and things would start happening in my life that all of a sudden I would start thinking, it's like, oh, that's a great example. I should put that in my book. And I never would have thought those things had I not made the original decision to write the book. So now we have all of the elements, and there's actually a technique behind this. And I give you all a handout called Creating a Personal Master Plan. This is the technique behind setting goals and states of being and habits and priming yourself in an effective way if you don't have a goals list or you haven't thought about this in a long time. And the general technique, to describe it very simply, is you take a couple pieces of paper, and the first step is you just do a mind dump. Get everything out of your mind. Don't try to categorize it. Don't try to sort it. Just anything that you think you might want to do at some point in your life, a la bucket list. It all goes down on paper. The second thing that you do is you sort it. And by the way, when you're doing the list, don't censor yourself. Anything goes. And if you are concerned that it would be embarrassing that somebody else finds this and reads this, you can always burn it later, right? But censoring yourself here doesn't help you. So you put everything down on paper. Step 2 is sorting it. So you look at every item on the list and you just ask yourself a question. Is this a goal? Is this a habit? Or is this a state of being? You try to categorize it there. Then for each of those things, particularly the goals, you want to ask yourself, why do I want this thing? And that helps you find the goals that are actually states of being in disguise. Okay? Once you get to that point, now you start culling the list. Okay? And I like to call this the sneaky prioritization algorithm, because we talked about we don't like to make trade-offs if we don't have to. And if you ask yourself this big list, what do I want the most? Your brain is probably going to come back with you and say, I want all of these things. Because if I didn't want it, it wouldn't be on the list. So you kind of have to force your brain into prioritizing these things in a real way. And the way you do that, as we talked about earlier, is by making trade-offs. So here is what you do. First, take your goals list and you say, if I could only do half of these things, which ones would I keep? And which ones am I going to put on my someday maybe list? So not right now, not important enough to do right now. I may want to do them later, but I can only do half of them. Okay, cut the list in half. Then cut it in half again, and cut it in half again, until you get to 3 or 5 of what will be the most important goals for you right now. Then do the same thing with your states of being. cut the list in half, cut the list in half, cut the list in half. Same thing. There are 3 to 5 states of being that are going to be naturally the most critical for you, the ones that are going to lead to most of what you want. The other ones will still be there, but they may not be as fundamental a guiding force in your life. So you just want to narrow it down to 3 to 5 states of being that are the most effective decision criteria for you. And for habits, you cut the list in half, cut the list in half, cut the list in half until you get to 1. Now, fair warning in advance, the last couple cuts are the hardest. They always are, by design. But that's where the primary value is. Because that last cut will tell you, of all of the things that feel really important in your life, what is actually going to get you more of what you want. And by making a choice, you are prioritizing. So prioritizing in a very real sense is the process of choosing all the things you're not going to do so you can focus on the things that'll make the biggest difference. So I recommend this. You should be doing at a minimum at least once a year. Better if you do it every 6 months, better if you do it every 3. So personally, I make an appointment with myself. This usually takes at least an hour and a half or 2 hours. I usually take myself out to lunch or dinner by myself, order whatever you want, sit alone in a booth. You don't need anything more than a notebook and a pen to do this. But if you do it regularly, you will be far more clear on what's actually important to you and actually be able to put down on paper what you want, how you're going to get it, and what you should do right now in order to lead you there. And so the master plan is really designed. It's not hard. It's not rocket science. There's nothing complicated about it. It's just a matter of choosing to sit down and do it. And by the end, you are going to have a lot more clarity of what you actually want. This is a way of identifying first what it is you really want. And if certain elements of what you want make you feel terrified, there are patterns or interpretations or things that are sending you into threat lockdown because of that, right? So then that moves into the area of what are all the things that you can do to reinterpret or to help calm your mind down that there's not actually a threat or the threat has gone away. So knowing what it is helps you identify those places where you're feeling particularly scared and do things about it. And then when you're doing your most important tasks every day, or your next actions every day, all the things that are on your master plan are by definition the most important things that you can and should be doing during the day. And that's where this approach kind of overlaps with the Zig Ziglar handbook of, like, these are the things I want, and I am going to do one thing every day that's going to lead me towards this result that I want. We're combining lots of different ideas and techniques into a single practice. Identifying it, diffusing ourselves if we need to, and then deciding every day we're going to do something that's going to lead us toward what we want. That's how the whole chain works. The way that I like to think about it is, in the vast majority of circumstances, there is literally no such thing as a failure. Either you try something and it works, which is great, or you try something and it doesn't work, and you now have more information and experience that will help you try it again. That's it.
Priming. Questions for reflection. What are you looking for right now? How can you prime yourself to recognize new or unexpected opportunities?
One more idea. The outcome of the personal master planning process, so defining your goals and habits and states of being, is ultimately making decisions. And a decision is the act of committing to a specific plan of action. Interesting historical note, the Latin root that resulted in the English decision means to cut off. You are cutting off other options and committing to one plan of action. So if you're not cutting off something that you could be doing, you are not making a decision. And it's important to understand that no decision is ever made with complete information. We are not omniscient beings. We never will be. You will never be completely sure that the decision that you're making is the right one, because the world is really too complex a place to be absolutely sure before you act. That said, failure to make a decision is in itself a decision, right? There are going to be consequences of that. Life does not stop if you decide to not choose. So a famous quote by former General Colin Powell, who basically said all decisions in a very complex, very changing, very high stakes environment like a battlefield are made with approximately 50% of the information that may be available for that thing. Because if you make decisions any slower, it's too late. And talking about the idea that in most decisions that you make, and in business, very few decisions are ever irrevocable, right? You can always go back and make a different decision. And if something doesn't work the first time, by making a decision, by acting, you now have more information that will help you make a better decision later. So for the best results, be very clear and very conscious when you're making a decision that you are making a decision, that you're cutting off other things, but make decisions quickly. Don't wait for all of the information before you act.
Decision. Questions for reflection. Are you resisting making a clear choice to take a certain action? Where is that resistance coming from? How can you come to a clear decision quickly based on the available information?